Welcome. Welcome to the third day of OCASI's Executive Directors Forum. Wanted to start our session with my mask. This mask is a promotion by the Canadian Chinese National Council Social Justice Network. It is part of the Toronto for All campaign, a campaign that was started by OCASI in 2016 with the support of the city, and since then handed over to the city, which has had a number of campaigns dealing with anti-racism, anti-Islamophobia, issues around trans and LGBTI issues, and now focusing on anti-Asian racism. Thank you, CCNC SJ, for such a wonderful promotion piece that is also practical. It's a great mask. It feels very comfortable. My name is Debbie Douglas. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the OCASI Executive Director. Before I introduce our moderator this afternoon, I would like to thank our funders, IRCC from the federal government, MCCSS from the province, and the United Way of Greater Toronto. OCASI acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This territory is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to acknowledge my African ancestors, brought here as an enslaved people against their will over 400 years ago. I acknowledge and pay homage to the legacy of resistance they've bequeathed me, and commit to continuing the solidarity with Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Welcome, panelists. This is going to be a fabulous panel, the two pandemics. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce your moderator for this afternoon, Andre Lin. Andre currently works for the Anti-Racism Directorate and is the lead policy advisor responsible for the strategic implementation of the Anti-Racism Act 2017 and related regulations and Ontario's anti-racism data standards in the education, child welfare, and justice sectors. Prior to joining the ARD, Andre was a project lead at the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, where he led the establishment of a backbone entity to support the overall coordination and alignment of initiatives under the Black Youth Action Plan. Andre has demonstrated a commitment and a passion for driving equitable and inclusive policy decisions to address economic, social, and physical barriers faced by low-income and equality-seeking groups. He has extensive academic research and community activism experience in the areas of migrant farm workers and immigration and settlement. Please welcome to our afternoon panel, Two Pandemics, Race and Structural Inequalities. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Debbie, and I'm glad to be the moderator for this, this panel, the Two Pandemics. Good afternoon, everybody. We're doing this virtual, and we're getting used to doing these conferences and these sessions virtually. As for your patience, as we work through any technical difficulties we may have, but I look forward to having great conversations with our panelists. We have 5 of them. I'm going to begin by asking them to introduce themselves. I have determined the order in which they will introduce themselves. We'll begin with Paulette, followed by Colette, then Ruth, followed by Paul, and then Peter. And in your introductions, we have 4 questions. You can choose to use any of the 4 questions as part of your introduction. And then we'll give you 5 minutes to talk about, to make some opening remarks. If in your introductions, you can also say your full name and which organization you represent. So the 4 questions, one of which you can use or more than one. What part of yourself do you bring to your workplace? What makes you get up every day in 2020? What is the joy you get out of this work? and what is the force behind your inspiration and your work. So I'll begin with Paulette. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Greetings to all of you who have joined us virtually, and to my co-panelists. And thank you, Andre, for the introduction. And thank you also to OCASI for inviting me to participate and to be here, albeit virtually, but still very dynamic and engaging conversation. I come to you today from the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat people, to whom I remain forever grateful that I, as a settler, am able to live, be nurtured, and have freedom of movement. I am grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land, while recognizing that the legacy of colonialism and land acknowledgements like this are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. I also give thanks to my ancestors, who for centuries were stolen and enslaved, but never accepted their plight. Instead, they fought and sacrificed their lives, such that I'm able to be here with you today. I thank them for fortifying me with the strength, resilience, fortitude, and innate quest for justice and equality for all nations. Before I launch into the subject matter of two pandemics, I'll give you a brief overview of the work we do at the Kenyan Women's Foundation, so you know where I'm coming from. The foundation launched almost 30 years ago. Next year will be our 30th anniversary. And it was launched to address a critical need for philanthropy focused on women. One of our founding mothers was the late, great Rosemary Brown, the first woman to run for the leadership of any federal party in Canada, and the first Black woman elected to a provincial legislature in Canada. Although there are no recollections of her uttering the term intersectionality, she named the experience through this phrase: until all of us have made it, none of us have made it. And her words continue to inspire our work today. Through funding, research, advocacy, and knowledge sharing, the foundation works to achieve systemic change that includes all women, girls, trans, two-spirit, and non-binary people. By supporting community programs, the foundation empowers women and girls to move themselves out of violence, out of poverty, and into confidence and leadership. We focus on those who are facing multiple barriers in communities where the needs are greatest. The pandemic is shining a glaring light on these long-standing social gaps, intensifying them, in fact. It's impossible not to see the colonial and racist legacy of a system where most undervalued and underpaid workers are those now risking their own health and lives to keep us all safe from COVID-19. A disproportionately high ratio of these essential service providers are Black and racialized women. The pandemic has made it clear that if we don't address systemic change now, we risk leaving people much worse off. That's why the foundation is releasing a series of resetting normal reports that center gender equality in the pandemic recovery. The journeys toward gender and racial equity are intertwined, and the foundation is committed to both. Step one in this plan is a new funding model for the women's sector, one that provides secure core funding to women serving and equity-seeking organizations so they can focus on their vital services rather than scrambling for funds. When the lockdown started, we surveyed 120 organizations and heard that about 80% were concerned about their ability to continue offering services. In fact, many have faced even higher demand while coping with new constraints, including higher expenses, reduced staff and volunteers, and lower fundraising capacity. So we've worked hard to provide rapid response funds to grassroots organizations that are at risk of closing their doors. But we're also aware of others who can't even receive funding because they don't have charitable or qualified donee status. We had begun advocating for changing those regulations a few years ago, because many of these ineligible organizations are doing incredible work at a very grassroots level, staffed by people whose lived experiences are unmatched. They shouldn't have to jump through additional hoops to secure funding. I sit on a committee that will be making recommendations to the Minister for Revenue, for National Revenue in the coming months. So there'll be more information about that shortly. Along with rethinking funding models and regulations, the philanthropic sector also needs to consider how its own structures and practices perpetuate colonialism and racism. Earlier this year, our staff read the book, Decolonizing Wealth, which helped us widen the lens through which we do our work. The book points out that for centuries, white supremacy has been used to justify colonial exploits and the amassing of wealth and power, largely on the backs of people of color, in particular Black people. Now, through the model of philanthropy, people of color must apply for access to that wealth in the form of loans or grants. In our principles of feminist funding, we also acknowledge that inherent power imbalances exist in the act of giving and receiving. We need to strive toward more equal partnerships with those we fund. One step toward this is using participatory decision-making processes so that communities most affected by our work have a say in what happens. So there's a lot to do when it comes to both change within and without our organizations if we want to tackle colonialism and anti-Black racism. But at a time when so much is in flux, I am optimistic about what we can accomplish together, maybe trepidly so, but still. And that's what makes me get up every day in this pandemic in 2020. The time is now to harness this urgency for systemic change that leaves no one behind. We all have a role to play in how we come out of this crisis, and it motivates me to know that that all of you actually share in this vision and are working toward it as well in your spaces and places where you're at. So I'm going to wrap up my comments by showing a very short video that captures the spirit of our resetting normal plans. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion later.
When COVID-19 spread in Canada, women were affected beyond the virus. Women accounted for almost 2/3 of early job losses, despite making up only half the paid workforce. Risks of violence increased, and calls to crisis lines surged. Demands of caregiving, homeschooling, and work skyrocketed. The virus can infect anyone, but the pandemic's impacts are different for some people. It has deepened inequalities for diverse women and two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people. As we rebuild from the pandemic, we can't accept a new normal where people are worse off than before. Let's reset normal by putting gender equality at the center, because gender equality puts everyone in a position to thrive. Reset normal, so everyone gets a living wage and equal pay, so everyone is safe from gender-based violence. So childcare, elder care, and housing are safe, affordable, and accessible. Act now. Let's reset normal. Sign the petition.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Colette. And Colette, you have about 5 or so minutes to do your introductions and opening comments.
Thank you very much, Andre. I'm really pleased to be here today with you all from the traditional territories of many nations, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Credit, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I appreciate the land acknowledgement as an opportunity to stop to reflect on the long history of colonialism and other forms of oppression in Canada, where we are now and our potential futures. It really is an honor to be in conversation with Ruth, Paulette, Peter, Paul, and Andre, all of whom inspire me to risk more for racial justice. I'm indebted to Debbie Douglas for this opportunity to add my perspective to the mix. Back in the 90s, Debbie and I spent many days unpacking invisible backpacks of privilege as anti-racism trainers at Camp Candelore in the Algonquin Highlands. Since then, our paths cross where people are organizing to rewrite the unjust rules we live by in this country, to create more decent work and a fair economy. Most recently, the firestorm created by COVID-19 brought us together. We've been passing buckets as fast as we can from Atkinson to OCASI to people who are experiencing intense precarity in this moment. It won't surprise you that Debbie invariably calls on me to reflect more deeply about white privilege and white supremacy when I least expect it, but when I most need to do the work. I am, after all, a white, cisgender, and straight mother of two. I'm also the head of a philanthropic foundation with a complex mission and a complicated history. That means the work is never done, but I take heart in the fact that I'm not doing it on my own. We can count on each other and on the personal reckoning and for repairing and reconstructing our social, political, and economic relations. In preparing to enter this discussion today, I tuned into the conversation Debbie has been having with you and other OCASI members since the start of the pandemic. Her blog posts have been a real gift to me and my team as we've grappled with what's going on. I hear in Debbie's words what Howard Thurman calls the sound of the genuine. So I'd like to share 3 phrases that have stuck with me and that I've been turning over in my mind lately. 1, everything is up in the air. 2, statements are not enough. And 3, we must center our collective imaginary on a new world. I'd like to say a few words about each point in the hope that my reflections will stimulate your own. Everything is up in the air. All narratives for the moment have been blown open. All the metrics are off, if only briefly. This quote from Poet Laureate Dionne Brand reminds me that the ground game has never been more important. This means organizing people where they live and work around a few core ideas like human rights and equity. Systems and structures built to exclude and exploit Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks are inherently immoral and unstable. They're built on the expectations of income and wealth inequality and environmental degradation, which are also the same. Their collapse is inevitable, so reconstruction must become our shared work. If we let the gravity of this moment sink in, the possibility of transformation exists, if only briefly. Statements are not enough. They can ground and tether us to people, places, and values, but too often they are words in search of bodies to put them into action. Using statements of solidarity as building blocks of new systems appeals to me, given Atkinson's focus on Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, building power to change the rules. Community benefit agreements attached to public infrastructure projects like the Eglinton Crosstown LRT communicate bold intentions, but they also indicate where significant attention must be placed on hiring targets, community amenities, support for existing small businesses, and other economic opportunities for those who don't usually benefit directly from multi-million-dollar development projects, for example. Above all, we must center our collective imaginary on a new world. I confess I had to look up this word imaginary when I saw it used as a noun and not as an adjective in Debbie's post. I discovered with some digging that this phrase has a deep and rich meaning. The collective imaginary is defined as a set of values, institutions, laws, and symbols through which people imagine their social whole. It's been said that when we can put the argument into a concrete shape, into an image, some hard phrase, round and solid as a ball, which we can see and handle and carry home with us, and the cause is half won. If the new world we seek has decentered whiteness, then what shapes, images, or phrases must our collective imaginary take? I deeply appreciate Paulette's focus on gender equality And I look forward to hearing what Peter, Paul, and Ruth think and where this question might take us in the next hour. Thanks.
Thank you, Colette. And we'll move on to Ruth.
Segos. Hello again. My name is Ruth Koleszar-Green, as you know. I'm coming from a different position. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work at York University, which means I'm not directly working in an agency or in a community group that is doing pandemic-related work. I, of course, belong to communities that do. Before I delve into that, I'm going to acknowledge the healthcare murder, and I'm saying murder, of Joyce Eschwan on September 28th. I state this because her murder is part of the systemic issues that are being faced by Indigenous communities. I'm also going to acknowledge the October 11th death of George Harvey Arwash, as he expressed fear for his life in a hospital bed, where he overheard nurses talking about the fact that they had another one in the bed and they could end all the problems by just giving him an injection, as he couldn't walk anyways. I'm stating this because this is part of the systemic discrimination in the healthcare system that is coupled with the fear of Indigenous communities around COVID-19. I'm also going to acknowledge that in this country, I say it nicely, there has been the enforced legislation of the Indian Act, in which created the reserve system. And that system is a system of systemic and structural inequalities. Inequalities that create disparities where 61 to 63, depending on the day, because water changes, First Nations are currently under a boil water requirement, which means if 10% of communities cannot access clean drinking water, how are they actually engaging in hand sanitation to keep themselves safe? We demonstrated that sanitation is one of the leading ways to combat the pandemic. If Indigenous communities on reserve, First Nations communities on reserve, are unable to access fresh, clean water, this is one of those major issues. I acknowledge that people have given land acknowledgements to where they are and where they're sitting. As a Haudenosaunee person, I am very grateful to that, as I sit on territory that my community and my ancestors have sat on since time immemorial, since, as I say, Sky Woman fell, which is a whole other story, but we don't have time for that. That takes 4 days. I have 5 minutes, and I've already used up one. But in this country, as we look across this space, the land and the relationship to land is foundational to our identities. Our relationship to the animals and to the waters and to those, the plants that grow on this earth are who we are. And it's inseparable from our experiences of the pandemic, of structural racism, of structural or systematic inequalities. In that, I would like to acknowledge my siblings, the Mi'kmaq siblings that are under threat from white supremacy at this very moment, as they are not able to engage in a livelihood, as their lobster nets have been ripped and torn, as fisheries, processing plants have been burnt. These issues of Nova Scotia and the fisheries need to be part and parcel of the systemic discrimination that is impacting this pandemic. I also acknowledge the arrest and detainment of hereditary chiefs on Wet'suwet'en territories. The Wet'suwet'en and the Dagomont decision, the Marshall decision is for Nova Scotia, and the Dagomont decision is for what's occurring in BC. These are foundational understandings of this society's constant harm to Indigenous people. In that, Indigenous communities are resistant, resilient, and responsive. We are asked what makes us, what part of myself do I bring to my work and my role? Well, I bring my whole self. I bring my community activist. In my bio, I always say I'm an activist turned academic, accidental academic. I can't even speak. And that's what makes me do this work. What makes me get up every day are my beautiful responsibilities, my children, because they are the resistance, they're the resilience of the fact that my great-grandmother was in residential school, my grandfather also in residential school. They are intergenerational survivors. They have survived the historic traumas, and they are what make me get up every day. What gives me joy is knowing that there are many Indigenous community members across this country that are fighting and supporting people as they struggle through COVID. And I decided I had to give out shout outs because these people need to have their names called. They need to be heard. So first off on my list is the amazing executive director of Thunder Woman Healing Lodge, a lodge that has not even put a shovel in the ground. They are still in the process. They have the land out in Scarborough, but they have not actually been able to start their build. But you know what they've done over this pandemic? Their work is with women who are leaving the federal and provincial injustice systems, and they have been putting women up in hotels so that as they leave these hotbeds of COVID-19 infections, the prison system, they are able to self-quarantine. So they've been putting women up in hotels since the beginning of the pandemic and creating spaces for women to be safe. I'm going to call out the Call Auntie project, or the Call Auntie Clinic, which is a co-project between 7th generation midwives and the Living Well Institute, in which Indigenous community members are able to call in and get sexual and reproductive health information and support, as well as family doctors through this pandemic time. In that, I would like to call out the people who have been paramount in this: Brianne Olson-Panawaquit, Krista Williamson, and Denise McLeod. These strong Indigenous aunties have been able to support Indigenous community. I'd also like to acknowledge some people, including Brianna's work around the Indigenous encampment, the setting of Indigenous community harm reduction spaces throughout the pandemic so that Indigenous people do not have to return to the shelter system where there are so many issues and problems within there. I acknowledge 7th generation midwives again. They do lots. They're pretty rockin'. They also helped catch both my babies. Well, 1 out of 2, long story. They missed the first birth. So 7th generation midwives, the Native Men's Residency, or NAME Res, and Living Well House for their rapid COVID testing for Indigenous community members, so that we can actually be within a space that respects our indigeneity as we experience healthcare and testing in healthcare. Testing for Indigenous communities has been very traumatic due to the fact and the impacts of colonial medical testing. The experiences of Indigenous communities historically as being medical guinea pigs has been harmful. We've seen it in the work of Dr. Ian Mosley around residential schools and vitamin deficiencies. But we also know that many vaccines were unethically tested upon Indigenous bodies on reserves. So I want to acknowledge those organizations for really making sure that Indigenous people are safe, and emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually, as we engage in the responsibility to be tested. I want to acknowledge Nicole Panek and Giselle Dias for their conversations on prison abolition and the importance of prison abolition in this time, in all time, but in this time where Indigenous people represent 33% of the prison population. So when we look at the impacts of COVID in prisons, how this impacts Indigenous people is huge. I'd also want to acknowledge some of the amazing grassroots activists who've been planning, co-organizing, and working for solidarity between Black and Indigenous communities, as well as memorial actions. Individuals like Elder Wanda Whitebird, Audrey Hetley, and No More Silence, who also organized a strawberry ceremony that takes place every year on February 14th to recognize missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. I want to acknowledge that as I get up every morning, these people, these names I've called, these strong organizations are the force for my inspiration of my work. They inspire me to do better for my community and for the faces that are not here yet. Nyaugoha.
Thank you, Ruth, and we'll move on to Paul.
Okay, thank you so much. First I want to thank OCASI for having me here as well. And Debbie, you're one of my heroes, one of my mentors. So when the invitation came, I said, of course. So thank you. My name is Paul Taylor, and I am the son of Bernadine Taylor and the grandson of Naomi Baker and the great-grandson of Rebecca Thompson. And they are my inspiration. I think about each and every single one of them and how so much of who they were and are is a part of me. I think about my mother and the days where she gave up food so that she didn't eat so that my brother and I could. I think about my grandmother who fed, children in the community. I think about my great-grandmother that fought and wanted the best for her kids and then grandkids and great-grandkids. And for me, in introducing myself, one of the things I've really started to do is to acknowledge that part of the reason I'm here, part of the reason I do this work is because of the labor of Black women that came before me, labor that's often uncelebrated, unrecognized. I wouldn't be here. And I think Black women play such an important role in our communities, often, holding up men. And sometimes we get over that wall, let's say, and we run off. But for me, it's been really important to acknowledge that my success, the work that I've been able to do, the pleasure that I take in my work, and the impact that I'm able to have, a lot of that comes from the work and the labor of 3 Black women that came before me. In my day job, I'm the executive director of an organization called Food Share Toronto. I work with an awesome team of people that, I might be the one of us that's here today, but I work with an incredible team of people that show up every day, that believe that change is possible and that want to see change and aren't afraid to do some of that hard, dirty work sometimes of advancing change in sometimes messy ways. One of the things I love about Food Share is, we think about, what is the foundation for our work? And I think many times, as we think about issues around food insecurity, we automatically default to kind of charitable response. And that's often where the conversation starts. What really inspired me about Food Share, and again, I want to acknowledge a woman that was, at Food Share for 25 years, who I come also after, a woman by the name of Debbie Field, that many of you I'm sure know. So what Food Share does is really centers the right to food. Not necessarily the right to charity, not the right to leftovers, not the right to two-legged carrots or what have you, but to the right to food. That's what we have in this country. That's what we've had in this country since 1976, and that's the work that we're going to advance. We also recognize that racial-inspired inequities cause disproportionately, folks that look like me to be more likely to be hungry, more likely to be poor, more likely to be food insecure. So what I really appreciate about Food Share is we center our work and our approach on racial justice, racial equity, as well as a rights-based conversation about the right to food. So what does that look like? Food Share, the way I haven't mastered an elevator pitch. It's been almost 3.5 years and I can't do it. So if you get stuck in an elevator with me, I'm gonna press all the buttons because we've got a long talk ahead of us. But I'm gonna try and break it into little buckets around how we do our work. The first thing that we do is instead of, like I say, giving out salty soup and stale muffins, what we say is people deserve access to fresh, beautiful produce, grade A produce. So we work with communities to build, and community leaders to build community food assets. So things, and this is one of the ways that we challenge capitalism that causes inequitable access to food. We say, let's build a subsidized market alongside community that they own, they run, they're in charge of, they set the hours. It's not about profit, it's about access. So we help communities set up affordable or subsidized markets, urban farms, market gardens, school food programs, but it's all about working, you know, taking our cue from community, looking at the resources that we have available to support the dreams, the ideas that's held in community, because one of the things we recognize is leadership exists in community. The other thing we do, and I kind of alluded to that, is we think about our, what's the capacity? What do we bring to the table that we can then provide, or how can we show up for grassroots folks that are on the front lines, that are defending land, air, water, our bodies? You know, how do we as an organization show up to support them? So that's something that we've been really thinking about and really encouraged more folks in the sector, you know, to think beyond our programs that we may be funded to do, but how do we say, you know, we've got a training line, for example. How do we reach out to grassroots groups and say, hey, what kind of training would be beneficial to you? You're under-resourced, you've got so much on your plate, how do we help you with that work? So that's an emerging part of our work. And then, like many of us, I think, ultimately, you know, in this country, as a result of the pandemic, there are about 5.5 million people that are food insecure. We know that charity isn't going to solve that work. So ultimately, a huge chunk of our work is advocating for progressive public policy aimed at advancing the right to food, ending food insecurity, and ending poverty. Another reason that I do this work is because of my childhood experiences. You know, I remember being a hungry kid raised by a single mom in a low-income household. We're on welfare, and I remember the shame, the embarrassment that I felt as a child, the isolation that comes with poverty and food insecurity that's often not talked about. So I may not be poor or hungry anymore, but I talk about this because this is a crisis in this country. We should not have this many people that are worried about where they're going to get the next meal, and it doesn't have to be that way. And for me, I remember I was 13 years old when I heard that there was this election in Ontario, and I was just getting interested in trying to understand politics and what it all meant. I know that I would often see white men on TV with suits and ties on the CBC, when my mom would be watching, and so she would call it something called "These Are Politicians," and this is about politics. So when Mike Harris was elected, as many of you know and have lived and have fought against, you know, one of the first things he did under the guise of a common sense revolution was he cut welfare by almost 22%. But what that meant is my family had, you know, let's say 22% less food. It was much more of a struggle to cover our costs. Eventually, we lost our electricity, our heat, and our hot water, you know, and spent many years living in Canadian winters in those experiences. And again, quite isolated and neglected, in essence, by our government. So a huge part of our work is how do we make sure that we don't allow our governments to walk away from their obligations, not just these, you know, international covenants like the right to food, but their moral obligation to make sure that none of us are hungry, we all have homes and the like. So maybe I'll just end with two other things. And I think one of the ways that I've been thinking about this recently and thinking about food insecurity is I really see food insecurity as a public policy failure, in the same way that I see the 45 billionaires that exist in this country as a public policy failure. So that is more of how my colleagues and I are framing our work and recognizing that it's public policy that we can use to redistribute wealth in ways that help us advance equity in all kinds of ways. Lastly, you know, I'm going to go back to my mother. I often talk about her. You know, one of the things that she inspired in me is two things, actually. She inspired in me, one, She's like, Paul, if you want to see change, you've got to go off and get it started. And two, she also inspired me to be an optimist. I'm an eternal optimist. So I do believe, I see the issues very clearly, but I do believe that better is possible. And my colleagues and I, our board, our volunteers, folks in communities across the city connected to Food Share, we're interested in really doing what we can to make better a reality. So, thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to all the panelists for your opening statements. You have left us with a lot of food for thought, and we're going to engage in some conversations with you as we reflect on what you've said. I'm just checking to see if Peter is on yet. Peter is here, so we're going to move on to Peter. Are you ready? Peter, you were here when we just began, so, you know, as part of your opening statement, you can tell us, you know, what part of yourself you bring to your work, what makes you get up every day in 2020, what's the joy you get out of this work, or what is the force behind your inspiration and work. So over to you as you give us about 5 minutes opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and nice to see you, Andre, I should say. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here with you. Today, I'd like to salute OCASI and, of course, Debbie Douglas for the wonderful leadership in convening this vital conversation that we're having today. Before I answer the questions, I think I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that I am here sitting on traditional, ancestral Anishinaabe land, and it's part of our duty to constantly and consistently acknowledge this as part of our responsibility of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I think for me, and so for those who don't know, I'm the director of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, which is a relatively new body within the federal government. This year we are celebrating this month we are celebrating our 1-year anniversary. And our mandate is really to lead a whole of government approach to combating systemic barriers, working with all departments and federal organizations, but also with other orders of government and with civil society to really develop key ways of identifying barriers, systemic barriers, gaps in program services, legislation, and policies, and advance new responsive and sustainable initiatives to address and tackle systemic racism that affect Black, Indigenous, Asian, other racialized and religious minority communities writ large across Canada. I think COVID-19 for me, in addition to being, as it was for many Canadians, a very shocking, almost traumatic experience, really helped to lay bare the clear disparities that pre-existed, so the pre-existing conditions which exacerbated, which allowed to a certain extent COVID to spread, that really, as the data is now increasingly showing, disproportionately affecting Indigenous, racialized, and religious minority communities and peoples writ large across Canada. And so in terms of the motivation for the work, I think that just seeing those discrepancies so clearly manifested, but also I'm hearing it directly from stakeholders from across the country, which really allows one to put a human face to the number. So it's not simply an abstract number. It is really, these are really people, families, communities across the board who are being disproportionately affected, whether it is in terms of their physical and mental health, whether it is their access to food security, whether it is their access to income, to employment, the list, and even to citizenship, the list goes on. And so that's why for me, it has been really kind of a confirmation of the need for me and my team to be extremely and more active and more vigilant and more proactive in working within the federal family to do what it takes to move the needle forward to addressing systemic racism in this particular context, which is COVID-19, one in which many of us were not prepared and were not aware that, of course, the pandemic was going to hit, but nonetheless placed many communities, as we've heard, at a disadvantage, particularly given those, as I said, pre-existing systemic racist conditions that have been a reality in this country for many years. And so I think I find hope and inspiration in the hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations, grassroots organizations, community organizations, faith groups, and the list goes on, who have really been mobilizing like none other to I guess, fill the gap that unfortunately still exists. At the federal level, we have, the federal government have taken steps to address these discrepancies, and there are numerous measures that have been introduced, announced, funding, and the list goes on. However, we do acknowledge and recognize, based on the commentary that we've been hearing directly from communities, that more needs to be done, that the discrepancy continues, the gap, the inequalities remain, and that there is a need for more proactive and sustained efforts to support the critical work that's being done across the country to address those systemic barriers and to essentially provide for well-being, community safety, wellness for racialized, Indigenous, and religious minorities communities across the country. So for me and for my team, it's really fundamentally about a responsibility and duty of accountability to Canadians, accountability to those who are on Canadian territory who may have a precarious immigration status. So we think of migrant workers, we think of international students, and we also consider the intersectionality of the challenge, looking at how women are disproportionately affected, how LGBTQ 2+ communities are disproportionately affected, and how that intersects with the realities of systemic racism. So the challenge is daunting. It's major. It is significant. But from our perspective, being able to work directly with and collaborate and connect directly with groups and organizations like yours and that are working across the country is really not only inspiring but important, because we will not be able to fulfill our responsibility, our mandate as a secretariat, which is to rid the federal government of systemic barriers, to fill in the gaps, without making sure that you are directly here at the table with us. So once again, thank everyone for your work, and thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Great, thank you, Peter. And we have just about under an hour and 15 minutes for this dialogue, and we're going to try and we will open up for questions, but I am going to take the moderator privilege to ask the first question. And I would like all of our panelists to take about 2 minutes so that we can get in as many questions as possible to answer my first question. So my first question is, COVID-19 has unveiled, and I've heard these words used by some of our panelists, and laid bare the injustices and inequalities that Indigenous, Blacks, racialized individuals and communities, as well as other historically equity-seeking groups face in their daily lives. These are not just numbers, these are people's lived experiences. It has also presented new and different opportunities to address these injustices and inequalities. And the question is, how will your organization work differently to bring about change and to improve the lives of those who you serve? So this is specifically around your organizations. How are you going to work differently given COVID and the challenge, but opportunities that it has also brought with it? Who would like to go first? Should I go in the order? Paulette, do you want to go first?
Sure. I don't think that's a question, right? I'm definitely going first.
Yes.
Well, I feel like I just need to pick up from where I left off around the social gaps that we're seeing now, and the fact that what we really need is systemic change. The unveiling, as you say, of what COVID has revealed really calls loudly for that on various levels. So advocacy is critical in terms of the work we're doing. No matter where we come from in that work, it's a critical part of that work. At the foundation, we've emphasized this in our work. So we have gone from being a fundraising, grant-making organization to broadening that to including in critical public policies that are impacting people's lives. So we want to be able to make change for good. So while we're doing that at the ground level in terms of the organizations that we fund at the grassroots, we need to be able to address the public policies that are being meted out, particularly federally, in terms of decisions that are being made. And we need to ensure that we are creating that systemic shift that is critical to ensure that further generations don't continue to get trapped, whether it's about housing, childcare, access to food, access to job, fair pay. All of these issues come into play when we talk about the importance of systemic change on all levels. And of course, underpinning all of that are issues around racism and sexism that continue to plague our communities across the country. So from our indigenous communities to racialized communities, and in particular, the revelation that we all knew, by the way, but the revelation that now more eyes are open to around the impact of COVID and who is most vulnerable and whose lives are at risk is revealing a lot. And one of the things that it's also revealing, while we're seeing who's on the front lines and who's actually risking their lives, it's also revealing how poorly we treat our seniors in this country, right? It's revealing how little we value them. And on the other end of the age spectrum, it's also revealing how little we truly value children, that we are not investing in their development and growth from the beginnings, and how we then discard our seniors because we're refusing to acknowledge that it shouldn't be a private company's affair about how they treat our elders. So I think I may have covered the age spectrum there, but I think it's critical that we are advocating continuously for systemic change.
Thank you, Paulette, and I'll move over to Colette.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody for your such thoughtful, profound remarks. I think, it bears repeating again and again and again that the kinds of outcomes that we've seen through the pandemic are not the chance of a health crisis, but are the result of systems, policies, and structures that have been hardwired over generations. The Foundation's work is about rebalancing power to achieve equity. That's at the heart of our mission. So right now, what we're doing is we support movement builders. I mean, we see ourselves in this movement. So we're coming alongside those who are organizing to engage Black, Indigenous, and communities of color in taking action on the issues that affect their material health and their well-being. We'll continue to do this, and I think as a MinSpec, we'll put out more money into the field in response to the increased complexity of this work, especially to reach people whose lives have been upended by the pandemic and whose experience barriers to accessing supports from public or other charitable supports. There's a lot of folks who are still, even with all of the programs that have been rolled out, are falling through the cracks, and it's really, really important. I think we're trying to advocate in new and more collaborative ways for income and basic public services that can make the difference between life and death for many communities. And I think the third piece is the board and the staff are taking our lead from leaders who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, leaning in, questioning white body privilege on a deeper level, figuring out how we call out white supremacy to challenge and change systems. Paulette talked earlier about how it shows up in philanthropy. It's hardwired in to how philanthropy was grown in this country in the first place. And I guess we've, trust and relationships are the foundation, upon which this foundation moves. And we feel a true sense of obligation and accountability to our longtime partners and to forging new relationships to meet this moment. And I guess I would just say that, we know, we are in awe of our partners and collaborators who each day show up, bringing organizing challenges at the front lines of this pandemic as they try to iterate policy options with government officials in real time. And I think it's just fair to say, we recognize how exhausting this work is. made harder and riskier by the ongoing need to provide emergency supports and community care, and to cope with the structural limitations and live with so many unknowns. And so we feel a very deep sense of obligation to be there and to listen and to follow their lead in terms of what we can do.
Thank you, and now shift right over to Ruth.
As I am an educator, it's something that's different than working for an organization. However, because years ago, one of my students, I think I'm funny. I know I probably am not, but I think I'm funny. That's enough for me. In that my students, one group of students dubbed me their favorite social justice comedian. And I use humor and I use tongue-in-cheek ways of engaging in order to have hard conversations. And as an educator, that's what my role in this is that I have the ability to, due to my position, to have large conversations with many people in many different spheres and different spaces, because let's be honest, everybody wants to have an Indigenous person on the panel, right? It's true. I'm making tongue-in-cheek joke, but it's true. And I use that time, that space as a commitment, as to problematize the lack of structural movement around Indigenous discussion. In my introduction, I forgot to talk about some of the amazing work that Paul's group is doing. And I know you work very closely with my friend, Crystal Sinclair, right? Yeah, don't you love when you find a mutual friend? You're like, yes. But there's also many other Indigenous communities working towards food security at this point. And so my role, as I see it, is to make those call outs, to call those names, to support people in the work that they're doing. I don't want their credit. I just want to know that everyone else gets to hear who's doing this work. I'm here only as an educator. And as an educator, it's my role to open younger eyes, newer eyes to the impacts of injustice for Black, queer, LGBTQ, Indigenous communities, and to help them understand the intersections and the interrelationships and the importance of those relationships to unraveling and building solidarity to support people coming through this pandemic so that there is a new normal. Paulette, I love that, reset normal, because that's, I see my role is to help bring in people who never thought about their white privilege, who never thought about the relationship between Black and Indigenous communities, who have never thought about these struggles as the intersections of gender, of two-spiritedness. And for, earlier in my presentation on Monday, I talked for quite a while about my connection to two-spirited community as a parent of two two-spirited children. And I feel like those are conversations that I have access to. And that's my role. That's my responsibility as an educator, to build relationships so that non-Indigenous community members can have those educational moments and find themselves finding commonality and community. So that's what I can offer.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And, we should never, ever discount the role of our educators. They're very important. Because you never know where they will end up, those that you influence. They may become the policy makers, the decision makers. So, you do have an influence. So it's great to have you on this panel.
And I'm also educating 2 children. Homeschooling is fun.
Good for you. Paul, your response to the question.
Okay. So I guess, anyone that knows me really well knows that I love to go on walks. I go on my morning walks, and it's where I take in so much of the world. I reflect. It's where at the beginning of the pandemic, I first realized that this pandemic was disproportionately affecting Black and brown women. Those are the folks that I saw on transit, much to my shock, at a time when, you know, we all know that it wasn't safe to be in transit. I know that these are women who are saying goodbye to their children every day, whose children know that it's not safe, wasn't safe to be out. So, you know, I love my walks because I reflect and I take in so much. And today I was really upset about something that I saw. I found myself grabbing my phone, getting ready. You ever have those moments? You see something that gets you upset and you grab your phone and you start getting ready to send that email. And I thought, no, I'm on my walk. But I'm going to share with you today what happened. I saw a vehicle driving by. I won't mention the organization because it's not important, but it said, you know, on the side of the vehicle, it said, ending hunger in our communities. And I froze, you know, and I was reflecting, you know, and I think we need to ask ourselves who that language serves. Does that language actually help us move the dial on the issues that we're trying to challenge? Or does that language of us pretending that we're solving these wicked issues, or does it hold those issues in place, ultimately protecting the status quo and our livelihoods as nonprofit workers? So I think these aren't always easy questions and reflections to ask and to share, but ultimately I think it requires us to be super grounded in what we want, what it is that we want to accomplish. What are we trying to achieve here? And again, I'm so proud of the work that my colleagues and I are doing, because we pretty publicly and boldly acknowledge that we will not solve poverty. We say it to our funders. The funders that come to us and say, you know, you're doing such a great job solving this. We say we're not solving poverty, nor are we solving food insecurity. Instead, what we do more often is we talk about the potential of income-based interventions and public policy to tackle those issues. You know, we recognize that it requires also, you know, donor and public education to demonstrate the value that our organizations do provide. But it also means that we're going beyond what I think are false narratives associated with nonprofits ending wicked problems that we simply don't have the capacity to end, and we should never be expected to. So here's how we're going to work differently, and I alluded to some of this earlier. You know, we're going to continue to expand this idea of who we serve, and to ensure that it includes the folks on the front lines of advancing progressive change. You know, the folks with lived experience or who have had to bear the brunt of the effects of capitalism, poverty, food insecurity, anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, ableism. The question for us becomes not only how can we animate, you know, the programs and supportive initiatives that we do, but how can we best leverage our resources to support the work that folks are engaged in right now? And those are folks that are often doing this work without pay, without adequate resourcing. I'm talking about, you know, land defenders across Turtle Island, the folks fighting for the abolition of the prison industrial complex, the indigenous climate activists putting their lives on the line for the planet, and the gig economy workers that are fighting back against extractive and oppressive capitalism. Some of us may not want to go stand on train tracks in solidarity with indigenous land defenders. Okay, I did, but I recognize that that's not something that Ruth was there too. That's not something that everybody feels comfortable with. But I think as leaders, it's really important for us to keep front and center that there are people who are doing that work, who are living the urgency and doing that work now, and they need and deserve our support. If we recognize that we need a revolution, we have to make sure that those revolutionaries are well-fueled, well-supported, and resourced. I'd give you a couple examples of how we've kind of shifted the way that we work a little bit. You know, I have spent a fair bit of time reflecting on the death of Regis Porchinsky-Paquette and the work of Not Another Black Life. You know, you'll remember that the Justice for Regis March was kind of the first gathering, you know, of folks during the pandemic, activists coming together. I was there, my board chair and friend Crystal Sinclair, and I'm sure many of you were there. You know, and it was a little scary, but you know, one of the things that we realized is it was also such a powerful healing space, honoring space, you know, to see Black and Indigenous folks in solidarity saying enough is enough. You know, so of course, after the march, because it was such a precarious time to hold a gathering, you know, the organizers, the folks behind Not Another Black Life said, you know, anyone that attended, you you know, we really recommend that you self-isolate for 2 weeks. So immediately we realized, well, there are going to be tons of people for whom self-isolating is going to be really difficult. How are they going to get their food? So what we did is we connected with the organizers and said, you know what, you can promise anybody that went to that march, and we're going to prioritize Black and Indigenous families, that they can receive a free good food box filled with fresh produce delivered to their homes for over the 2 weeks that they were self-isolating. And also, you know, when the Fedora workers, you know, when Fedora decided to up and leave, despite the parent company Delivery Hero boasting record profits, these workers, you know, and our work is focused on Toronto. So there were 500 of these workers across the city of Toronto who 2 weeks ago, we were, you know, recognizing them in the news as essential food system workers. They were delivering food to us at a time when we were not able to get it. We were afraid to go out and get it ourselves. Then this company says, you know what? There's organizing happening, there's momentum, of the labor rights momentum, so we're gonna up and leave. So what FoodShare did is reached out to the organizers of the folks behind Foodsters United, who had been organizing some of the Fedora workers, and said, you know what, for those 500 workers that we were all celebrating as essential workers, we wanna make sure that we are supporting them. So what we did is we arranged to have our team deliver good food boxes. I think we did 3 good food boxes to all 500 of those workers over the course of the pandemic. Again, these are folks who are on the front lines of this revolution. They're fighting back against nasty employers and poor labor legislation. And I'm also pleased to see Colette here, because it was the Atkinson Foundation that came to us and heard about the work that we were doing and said, here's some money to support that work of supporting folks on the front lines. You know, so that for us was really important. And, you know, as I close for this question, thinking about how we're gonna, you know, I think it was about how we're gonna change. Well, I think my board chair has been mentioned, Crystal Sinclair. She's an Indigenous activist, one of my favorite people on this planet, one of the founders of Idle No More and Idle No More Toronto. And, you know, Crystal and I are not gonna change. We are gonna continue taking up space, the space that we've been robbed of, and we're gonna continue to be bold, and in my case, Black, and in Crystal's case, Indigenous. And we're gonna lead the way that our ancestors have taught us to lead.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Peter, I'm gonna allow you to take that question too, but I'm gonna ask you if you could take 2 minutes, because we have questions coming in from the audience, and I wanna get to as many of them as possible. So 2 minutes.
I will try my best.
No promises.
I tend to babble, so please stop me if I do. So I think when COVID hit, definitely changed our working style, and you know, we realized very quickly that we had to change it. Just in the government, as you probably saw, federal level, everybody was essentially confined to their homes and having to work from home. So the reality of telework. But beyond that, when we started, I guess, engaging with Black, Indigenous, Asian, and religious minority communities, we soon realized that there was something, you know, terribly wrong. And the problem, that which was terribly wrong, was that was of a systemic nature. And thus it necessitated a structured, a systematic, and sustainable response from the federal government. And so there were 3 kind of observations that we had very quickly. First, in order to develop that response, first, there needed to be widespread whole of government acknowledgement and understanding of the problem. Second, that there needed to be a collaborative, almost collective impact approach within government, across government, to address the issue. And third, that it was, and perhaps most importantly, that the voices of those who are most affected, and we're talking about communities who are directly affected by racism, needed to be centered within that process. So what we did was we set up a task force called the Equity Seeking Communities and COVID-19 Task Force, which was an interdepartmental task force bringing over 25 different departments together to look at solutions. And just so you understand, normally in government, and it's something I learned as it's been here for 1 year, these type of communities, maybe 10, 15 people show up. But at ours, between 80 and 130 representatives from 20 different departments and federal institutions showed up for each of the meetings to really delve into the issues, which showed the recognition that there was a need for a common collective approach to the issue. So what we started doing was we brought in subject matter experts from communities who had lived experience, but we also realized that that wasn't sufficient. The approach was not to, if I can say, crown a king or queen of a community, but really ensure that a wide spectrum of voices and perspectives from the different communities would be heard. And as a result, we started hosting over the course of the summer 8 town halls, virtual town halls with Black communities, Indigenous communities, Asian communities, and the list goes on, really to delve in depth into first what the issues are, how COVID was impacting, second, how effective the federal response was being, where the gaps were, and third, what were the new measures that were needed to fill those gaps if there were, particularly to help those who were falling through the cracks. And we heard quite a lot of very important information in terms of what the gaps were, what the impact was, but also what the government, the federal government, should be doing to advance to address those gaps. And so we've been, as part of our mandate, pushing and working across our federal counterparts to really try to make sure that those recommendations become part of the policy, program, services, even legislation. But I guess, and I'll try to end here because I feel that I've overstepped the 2 minutes. But again, what we're seeing is that it's vital, it's key for us to work with civil society, because we're not able to fulfill our mandate without civil society as a team of 10.
Thank you, Peter. And I have a question from our audience directed to you. Some of it you've started to answer, but in particular, you know, they're asking about shifting mindset, and they're very specific about that. It's in regards to funding allocations. So from where you sit, what type of work is funded and who is funded? So if you have any response to that kind of to that question.
I think that's an excellent and very timely question, and that's one of the issues that you know, was very important for us as a secretariat as we started. There has been a tendency in the past to direct or redirect, you know, racialized community and religious minority community organizations to multiculturalism funding within the federal government, which anybody who knows the federal government knows that the pot is this big. Whereas there are literally billions and billions of dollars in other other departments for, you know, to address issues that directly impact and disproportionately impact Indigenous, racialized minority and religious minority communities. And so part of our role as a hub for everything anti-racism within the federal government is to provide access to communities to those funds. And so we have a listserv of over 10,000 organizations now. On a regular basis, we provide the information about those funds that are available that they may not necessarily know about because the information has historically not gotten to the community. So that's one of the ways in which we are trying to break down that almost systematic and systemic approach to funding. But the other thing that we're doing is, and perhaps more looking at from a more of a kind of embedding and structural, institutional, and a sustainable perspective, is developing what's called an anti-racism plus lens. So the idea here is that for everything that the federal government does, they will need to apply that anti-racism plus lens in developing the policy, developing the program, developing the service and the legislation, so that we make sure that an anti-racism, a human rights and equity lens is applied as a companion to gender-based analysis plus, or GBA plus as it's known. So that's you know, some of the, because we understand that we're in here for the long haul. We're talking about 400 years of injustices, which will definitely not be resolved by 10 people, or let alone in 3 years. So we have to lay the foundation for longer term action.
Okay, and thank you for that, Peter, because I think that's a very important sharing of information that we need to know that's happening. And I think it was Colette who spoke about supporting movement builders. And I think this is part of how we can shift some of those ideas and those that are doing the advocacy work around, and Paul mentioned it, doing more around public policy. So that's important to know. I have a question, and it goes to anybody on the panel who wants to answer it. It is, what is your advice to OCASI member agencies that want to address structural racism within their own organization? And a follow-up question to that is, when should they start? Anybody would like to answer that question? So it's an advice to OCASI member agencies, recognizing that within some of those organizations, there are issues related to structural racism. What advice do you have for them?
Well, maybe I'll start.
Thanks.
And maybe Ruth will follow. So I'm not an OCASI member organization, so I think I can speak freely. Right, Debbie?
Always.
Well, you know, first of all, maybe I'll start with the when. It should have been yesterday. And in terms of where do you start, it really is about knowing your organization and taking a really close look, if not an audit, about what is your mission, who is being served by your mission, looking at who is leading your organization, who is not leading your organization, who's making decisions around investments of funds, who's making decisions around where programs and services are provided, who is delivering those programs and services, and ensuring that based on your community, based on your let's say catchment area, but also based on, you know, values and principles that you've put in place to ensure that you're equitably serving and representing your community, then you can get a strong sense of whether or not you're meeting the mission. Because if there are folks that are missing from your tables of decision makers, if there are folks that are missing in terms of the reach of your programs, if there are folks are missing in terms of those who are serving the communities within your catchment area, then there is some work to be done. And then, and I think it has a lot to do with how you're spending those resources. Who are you hiring and who are you not hiring? You know, these are important questions. But I think it first starts with an internal look about who are you as an organization? Who do you desire to be? Is the mission still valid? And what are the principles and values that are guiding the organization? So maybe that's just...
Sorry. Ruth, do you want to
My
have
response
anything to add?
when was also going to be, why isn't it already done? Wasn't that yesterday's work? That was on yesterday's to-do list. I agree 100%. But one of the things I always caution is when you do that audit, when you see whose voices is not there, don't allow for tokenistic voicing then. Don't have one service user who is actually afraid to have their services removed. Have actual engagement with the people that are missing, and acknowledge that just because you come from that community doesn't mean that you're doing free labor, right? Pay the racialized Indigenous community members honorarium, make it so that it doesn't come out if they are on a social assistance, you know, that it doesn't come from it, that it's not a clawback.
Yeah.
So don't ask for their social insurance number. Find some way around it. I don't care. It's not, you know, I've got lots of numbers. I don't need to be giving off my numbers for the work that I do. This is work that, you know, needs to be acknowledged in real ways as well. So non-tokenistic, really engage people with the resources that they need, ensure that it's done. Like, make a commitment publicly to your community and follow up. We have all of these statements, but statements aren't enough, right? It was said earlier, statements aren't enough. And the last one is, I always will question, how are you building a relationship that's anti-racist to the land you're on? Who is the community's land you're on? And how can you make sure that community is not being exploited again as you try to support other people who have come to join us on this territory. So ensure that as you support the people who work in your agencies or who are coming to your agencies, that it's not at the cost of the Indigenous community that you are settled upon. Just my thoughts.
Thank you, Ruth. Did I see Colette want to say something? Yes.
Yeah, I guess the final thing I'd say to the white folk who are in the audience is that we've got to do the work every day to roll back the layers of denial we've been taught to normalize white body supremacy. You know, it's something that I think has, particularly those of us who think we're progressive, that we've done the work, but early work doesn't inoculate you from all the blind spots that are created by white supremacy. And so I think we have to, not necessarily in our organizations, this is work we have to do on our own time, but also within our organizations to every day come with the practice of, you know, how am I going to decenter whiteness in myself, in my work, in my institutions. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah. And I see Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and, like, I just loved everything that I heard from everyone, so I'm going to try not to say anything that's been said already. But I guess one thing that jumps out at me is this work is not free, you know? And so the first thing where you start, yes, like Ruth said, an organizational commitment is key, but also next, a budgetary commitment is key. Because this work is not free, and it's not just the budget to hire a consultant, it's the budget to actually advance change within your organization. At FoodShare, one of the things we did is we recognized that, you know, Black and brown folks, racialized folks, Indigenous folks are more likely to be, or disproportionately reflected in low wage positions in our food system. The same is true of food organizations, and I'm sure other organizations. So what we did is when we looked at our pay grid and did a pay grid review, we gave the folks at the bottom of the pay grid a 25% increase. Mm-hmm. Folks at the top of the pay grid, no increase, because those are the folks that, so I share that example because that's an economic justice intervention, that's a racial justice intervention, and again, it's not free. So make sure you have your budget ready when you start to engage in this work.
Thank you, Paul. And I just add one more comment to that. I think, you know, it's not just only your employees, but I think you need also to look at your board composition, who is on your board and what they bring to the board. So I think that's important. We have more questions coming in. Oh, sorry, Peter.
May I add?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. All right. So I guess another piece, if I may, that I'd add is so this important distinction, at least from my eyes, between symbolic and substantive representation. So symbolic is basically having a beautiful black face, and the substantive is that the actual issues and equity and you know, human rights are advanced. And so we've seen, and I'll try and not get myself in trouble and not call out anybody, but we've seen over the last few months, racialized folk in positions of interest, you know, do things or that have been perceived to be reinforcing white supremacist messaging and structures. And so I think what is key is to look at the extent to which the spaces that we've created that are there, the extent to which they're safe, and the extent to which they are brave. So that is a key. So that's part of the kind of the structural, the policy work that frames the space within which either people are actually working full time or being hired to consult. So that, from my perspective, is a vital distinction and point to make.
Thank you. And I have another question here. It says, in a context where right-wing actors are appropriating progressive discourses, how can we take a progressive critical position on public health measures that threaten, dissent, and negatively impact or target Black, Indigenous, and people of color, migrant, and poor communities? Who would like to go first on that particular question? Don't all raise your hand at the same time. Are you taking it, Ruth? Yes.
Can you reread?
Yes, so it's really talking about that, you know, we know that there's appropriation of progressive discourses by right-wing actors, and the question is, how can we in turn take progressive critical positions? And they're really speaking primarily related to public health measures. So anybody who wants to take that question. And they mentioned migrant and poor communities as you know, very specific groups.
I'll take a crack. Oh.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll make a very short comment. Power is the ability to change the rules. And so I think we have to be thinking about always right now. And, you know, I think Paul really beautifully described in how they're doing it in Food Share, how you build power from where you are. Then he also talked about, and others have, about how we share power. And then how in our respective institutions, again, where we wield it and we use it. And I think that our ability to come in and as a foundation, it's about how we get behind the leaders who are doing this work day in, day out on the ground to challenge the narratives, to challenge the practices, the behavior that are so destructive and damaging, creating the kinds of conditions and outcomes we see for people today. So I just stop there.
Anybody else? Thank you, Colette.
Maybe I can add something to that, because it makes me think of back in, I don't know, when was the Mike Harris regime, right? The co-opting of the language, yeah. Right? Is kind of where it started. And I think that's when I first remember it, much younger at that time, but I remember that because I came out of, you know, an activist background, you know, and when someone said revolution, I want to say, sign me up, because that's in my blood. You know, I've worn off many shoes in this city, marching against police brutality and the killing of Black people. And so for me, when I think about that, first of all, the fact that they're copying our language is sort of a backhanded compliment to the fact that we are out front, and they're afraid. Like so that's why Colette's comments are important, because we don't know the fullness of our power, but together we are powerful beyond our imagination. And so when we get together, the incredible power that you feel when you get out of your doors, even during COVID, and march with I live in Pickering. We organized a demonstration in Pickering, people, right? Of young people, where about 300 people came out in Pickering and marched during COVID around the killing of Black people, not in the US, but here in Canada, as well as the brutality of people in Pickering, right? And so I think that our power comes from each other. It's when we know that we have that common purpose and conviction to create change. And guess what? We're seeing that change, right? COVID has shown us so much, right? COVID has shown us as a society, we have the incredible ability to pivot to save our lives. We don't do it for all lives the way we should, but we have the incredible power to pivot and adapt. And so that tells me that once we're convicted by something, that we have the power to change it. Because I think for so long we've been going along as if all we can do is chip away, just chip away, chip away, chip away. Well, we can actually transform, right? So I say, let them keep copying, because we'll always be ahead and we will always have the power with us, right? That's kind of how it is. And all we have to do is just keep going together.
Yes, thank you. Anybody else before I move on to another question? And I think I heard you say, Paulette, reset the normal. I think it was in that clip that you showed us. And, you know, I would like to build on that. How do we reset the normal? What is one, as we do that, what is one policy that you think will drive transformation? Whether it's a legislative thing or it's regulation or it's practice. What from your perspective, where you're working, the sector you work in, or you're from an organizational point of view, what is that one policy that you think will drive transformation and help us to reset normal? Yes, Ruth.
Can we remove the Indian Act?
Sorry?
Can we remove the Indian Act?
Absolutely. How do we do that? And that's the question. You know, what supports do we need to move that forward?
I joke about the Indian Act because it's one of the foundations that has created Canada.
Yeah.
And if we want to dismantle any problematic social policy, any problematic policy, period, we actually need to look at and dismantle in an equitable, with engagement of Indigenous communities, and not just the elected leadership that answers to the AFN or the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs. We need to dismantle the Indian Act in a way that allows not this inclusion of Indigenous people into the body politic, there's a quote there, but into an understanding as distinct nations. And I have a very good mentor, her name's Akua Benjamin, and she was winning an award for her work as a Black social justice educator. And I was sitting beside her as she was getting up to do her speech. And she said to me, "Sister, none of us are free until you are free." And as commitment, my commitment to her and to Black and other racialized communities is I'm going to fight for the removal of the Indian Act so that we all can start to work together for a more equitable space. And when Indigenous communities are not in that marginalized space, we will assert immigration law based on the great laws of peace. We will assert immigration laws based on relationships, that this is a community where we knew everyone would come and join us. And that's what I'm looking forward to. Maybe it's post-apocalyptic, but whatever, let's go post-apocalyptic, as we are going to look at post-COVID time.
Yep, and we have to set our mind to doing it. Anybody else? A policy that you think? Yes, Paul.
So I'm going to push back a little bit on a policy, because I think often in this, in this work, we focus in on one specific policy, but it's important to recognize that, of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So most recently, an example would be like basic income. There's lots of excitement and conversation around basic income. Well, there could be a basic income, but housing costs could go up, childcare costs continue to go up. So I'm less interested in one specific policy. I'm more interested in a framework that advances human rights, the rights of Indigenous folks, our rights to food, our rights to housing. That's what I want to see. And then we can look at policy and say, okay, well, maybe an income floor is one of those pieces, but so too is a guarantee of public services. So too, I also think about, there's no reconciliation without truth and without justice. So perhaps there's restitution by way of things like reparations. And, I think we need the framework and then build out the policies that help advance that framework.
Yeah, point well taken.
I looked at Debbie, and I think there was a roadmap written, wasn't there, Debbie?
That's right. We spent 18 months writing that roadmap for the Ontario government.
Yeah, I see, Paulette, you wanted to say something. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to build from where Paul left off and sort of give an example. And we have a new participant, it seems, with that approach in terms of a framework, because when I think of the work that we support and fund and invest in across the country, the biggest piece of that work is around gender-based violence. And you know, we have every 6 days in this country, a woman is murdered by her intimate partner, right? We also know that Indigenous women, First Nations, Métis Indigenous women in this country are impacted the most severe among women in Canada. We know about the missing and murdered Indigenous women in the thousands, in fact. And so we have a real problem in Canada, I'm sitting at a table right now, an advisory table to Minister Monsef in terms of creating a gender violence, gender-based prevention or policy or structure to address gender-based violence in Canada. However, what's really clear is that there's no way we're going to succeed in actually addressing this pandemic in Canada unless we address issues around poverty, unless we address issues around racism, unless we address issues that are intricately tied to what leaves women vulnerable such that they can't access affordable, accessible housing, that they can't access and be able to safely leave their homes without feeling as if they're risking their entire lives and that of their children. And so we need to have that kind of framework that wraps around women who are escaping for their lives so that they don't have to feel as if, and what we all know is that when they are escaping for their lives, that's when they are most vulnerable to being killed. And so women must have safe spaces to go in order to be able to rebuild their lives. So, you know, a shelter should not be the end all and be all. It should only be a temporary space. But many women end up in shelter after shelter after shelter because there isn't enough affordable housing for them to actually leave and go to, right? Or to be able to get themselves into whatever programs that they want to do in terms of rebuilding their lives, right? So one policy is important, and we as organizations, we do our best to identify what priorities are, but we have to know that unless we have a framework through which we're all working, because we all can't work on the same things, right? Our budgets probably won't allow us to do that, but we all have to understand that we have to work within a framework in order to move any single public policy.
Thank you. Ruth, did you want to have something to say?
I just wanted to echo exactly what Paulette was saying, but add in an acknowledgement that for women to be able to safely leave any space, our children must not then come under, especially as Indigenous and Black families, they must not come under the guise of child welfare, because child welfare can cause so many more traumas to a family structure as a woman is engaging in ways to make her life safer. And, you know, moving into a shelter and having to call CAS because children are coming into shelter systems, or any of those understandings within that policy of they changed the name and I always forget the new name. Maybe it's, you know, a decision to forget the new name of the Family Act. You know, how do we look at those sorts of spaces and advocate holistically for families and for women with children to find safe spaces for their children?
Thanks. And I know, Colette, you had something you wanted to add.
Well, I'm so enamored by my colleagues. I would, you know, absolutely echo and challenge. You know, I mean, we can put out a challenge here. I don't know, Debbie, if there are any of our political leader or other public sector managers in the audience to take on this challenge championed about building a framework that is led by Black, Indigenous, and community of colors, their leaders, taking our lead from voices who have been ignored and silenced for too long. And with the recognition that we're gonna have to grapple while doing with the goal of being an anti-racist and anti-colonial country. I would say specifically, like for one of the things for me right now In the pandemic, though, that is very serious, and I just want to also put out, building on other people's comments, is the issue of status for all, which has become such a profound issue as borders have closed, particularly south to the US, and that I think it is an issue critical to ensure the inherent worth and dignity that all people are protected and everyone can access public supports needed to navigate these challenging times. So I just want to put that out, given the global context we're in, and this community of OCASI.
So I have two questions, and I'm hoping we can get to them. Just building on the whole idea of having a framework, we have a question here about the value of strategic partnerships. And I'll take two responses to that, because there's another question I'd like us to get to. Anybody want to talk about the value of strategic partnerships? And, while we're at it, how do we make strategic partnerships work?
I just want to ask if Debbie's the one choosing these questions.
I'm not, actually.
I thought you were going to answer it.
I've really put myself out there, haven't I?
And there's a very specific question for you, Paulette. So maybe I'll move to that one while others think about it. It says, we're very surprised to see the absence of immigrant, refugee, non-status, Black and racialized women in the GBV prevention framework. How will you ensure the experiences of these women are centered as part of that framework?
Thank you for the question. I'm working on it.
Okay. All right. So nobody wants to... Go ahead. Sorry, Paulette.
I just want to say it hasn't gone unnoticed. Working on it.
Okay. Appreciate that. In terms of the strategic partnerships, nobody's will. Yes, Paul?
I can say, I'm thinking about some of the work that we did around our emergency good food box and some of the partnerships that we forged. But even before that, I'll say, one of the key things for us has been around establishing strategic partnerships is two things. One, listening and working to build a relationship in the right way, and for me, that's about listening and being willing to change. Because sometimes through those conversations, often through those conversations, we will recognize that we're not doing something correctly. It's something, or we're actually reimposing a barrier on a community in some way. So I think being willing to listen and change. But I think, some of the work that we did around the emergency good food box, where we partnered quite quickly with, I think close to 80 organizations and groups, grassroots groups often across the city, is we know this issue that we're working on, food insecurity, is disproportionately felt by BIPOC folks. So we were intentional in striking those relationships, that we didn't put out an open call necessarily, but what we did is we reached out to groups that we knew that were on the ground, that were working with Black, Indigenous, and other POC folk, and that was key for us. So I think really important thinking about, again, how we leverage our resources and thinking about the folks that are most affected by the issues that we're working on so that they're not missed.
Thank you, Paul. And we have just around 15 minutes left. We didn't think that we could do 2 hours, but it looks like we are heading down to the 2-hour mark very quickly. So I want to ask if I'm going to give you an opportunity to say any closing statements, closing remarks that you may have, and then we'll wrap up after that. So Peter, I'm going to start with you since we ended with opening remarks with you. So do you want to go first in terms of any closing comments that you want to make?
I had a horrible feeling that you'd be coming to me. So So listen, I mean, for me, this has been an absolutely wonderful and passionate conversation. I'll say a few words in French, étant donné que nous avons deux langues officielles au Canada, puis j'espère que les gens pourront me comprendre. Pour moi, ça a vraiment été une conversation très riche, un dialogue très riche, auquel que nous avons vraiment pu cerner des problématiques, des enjeux qui méritent davantage de réflexion, mais également des politiques, des programmes et des services. Donc, au secrétariat de lutte contre le racisme, on est en train de regarder ces enjeux, puis on va certainement prendre les recommandations qui ont été faites aujourd'hui, puis les partager au sein de l'appareil gouvernemental. So I was just saying that it's been a really great, passionate, and enriching conversation for me. Great ideas, great recommendations, great points that have been raised that I think will be very useful for me and for my team as we work across government to really look at the second phase of addressing the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black, Indigenous, Asian, and other racialized and religious minority communities across the board. Really impressed by my colleagues, around the table in terms of the work that you're doing. Very inspirational, and I think there's a lot for us to learn at the federal level in terms of what you're doing. So I guess I'd close and say I definitely would like to pursue the conversation, pursue the dialogue, and really work with you and with the network of organizations that OCASI has convened today. It's really important that the voices of newcomers and including those with precarious immigration status be heard, their needs met and realities answered. So we look forward to in the near future working together and to really address those issues and work to eradicating systemic racism across the board in Canada.
Thank you, Peter, and I'll go to Paul next.
Yeah, I started with talking about Black women and the Black women in my life. So I'm going to end actually also with talking about women. As someone that identifies as a man, there's this something has been made abundantly clear to me in this pandemic, and we've heard today on the panel as well, but it's how disproportionately it's affected women in all kinds of ways. All we have to do is think about our Zoom meetings and who has the kids running onto the cameras, who has to leave the meeting because a child is having a tantrum and needs to be put to bed or for a nap. Not to mention the many women that have already lost their jobs and without childcare can't go look for new work. So I think we have a real opportunity to advance gender equality as well as racial equality in the sector and across the country. I think it must involve, and I know I avoid talking about specific policies sometimes, but from what I've been hearing, it must involve pushing for universal public childcare, to providing childcare subsidies for evening and weekend meetings, and things like ensuring that tampons and pads are in all of our washrooms. There's so many ways that we could be showing up for women better in this sector, and I challenge us all to do that.
Thank you, Paul, and we'll take on your challenge. For those that are out there listening, that's important. Ruth.
Okay, I guess I'm middle. I'm a middle child. So middle in the intros, middle in the conclusion. First, I want to say Nyao Goa to my co-panelists. You're amazing, and I'm so grateful for all the work you're doing. Paul, guess what just happened? A child walked into my room. As a woman, it happens all the time. As a single mama, I actually became a single mama over the time of the pandemic, which has been a hard and challenging time for me, to find spaces and places of support. But these are actually really, really life-giving to me, to spend time in spaces with such brilliant, such passionate, committed individuals. I know that the people listening are just as dynamic as these panelists that I've gotten to share the past 2 hours with. And I'm very grateful for that. It is important that as we build relations, that Indigenous and agencies serving immigrants find our ways of being family, of being in relationship to each other. This is our territory, our shared spaces. We do land acknowledgements to acknowledge where we are from, where we are, and where child moment, where we are going. But we also need to acknowledge that this, in our teachings as Haudenosaunee people, we have always said that the ever-growing tree will provide solace and safety. So when I talk about the struggles of communities, racialized, new immigrant communities, communities in poverty, I know that there is intersections, overlapping. And the identities of Indigenous people are not just siloed. There are Black Indigenous community members. How are those experiences being taken up and understood in this space? And sorry, little one. And how do we move forward to support all racialized Indigenous communities? So, yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. And to Colette next.
So I want to thank everyone and thank the audience for the conversation today and for the work that you do every day. I'd like to use my last couple of minutes just to raise up a report today that came out by the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, the Caregivers Action Center, the Caregivers Connection Education and Support Center, and the Vancouver Committee for Domestic Workers and Caregiver Rights. The report compiled hundreds of surveys filled out by migrant care workers during COVID-19, telling their stories about their conditions of entrapment, of long hours, and thousands of dollars in stolen wages. It shows the enormous power employers have to abuse and exploit them, but also the ways in which migrant women are refusing to stay silent and stepping up. So my invitation to you as I finish my time with you all today is to show our solidarity. If you're on Twitter, go to @Migrant Rights CA or Facebook @Migrant Rights CA and join me in following them and helping amplify their voices using the hashtag status for all. And again, gratitude to everybody for the time.
Thank you, Colette. And is it possible to share the link to the report? That would be good. Yes. And just as we started, we're going to be ending with Paulette.
Thank you so much, Andre. I thank you for moderating this conversation so expertly. Thanks to Debbie and the OCASI team for this opportunity to hang out with some brilliant people, and to share our passions with each other and to get to know each other a little bit more, because during this pandemic, you know, it is not an opportunity unless we do it virtually. And so I think what this demonstrates is that we can actually get great work done despite the conditions that we are enduring right now. I think I'll probably just wrap up with some personal points with respect to what calls me and keeps me in this work. I've been doing this work now for over 3 decades. I can't believe I'm saying that, but that's certainly true. What keeps me in it, you know, before I hinted at some at the fact that I'm an optimist, but somewhat with some trepidation. But I would say that I am an optimist. I'm someone that wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't believe that change was possible. I have seen change, and it is seeing the change that actually makes me keep going. I'm inspired by what is possible through the collective work that we're all doing. I'm inspired by the brilliance of people doing this work in communities right throughout this country and around the world. And I'm inspired by how closer we are because of our commitment, our never-ending commitment to justice and equality. And I'm also inspired by the fact that despite the history of Black people, of my lineage, that where it was meant to really destroy us, that we live today, and that we who have been so discriminated against and so hated over the centuries are the ones that's actually going to bring about the change we need. So we're the ones that we've been waiting for in order to get this done. And that's what excites me.
Thank you so much, Colette. Sorry, Paulette. That is absolutely true. That, you know, many of us have seen things change over time, and sometimes we don't see change fast enough. But things that have changed do give us hope and optimism. So I'm really happy you profile that. I'd like to thank all of you, all the panelists, Paulette, Colette, Ruth, Paul, and Peter, for being part of this this panel and for your engagement, your conversations, your reflections, the inspiration you're given to those that are part of the audience to continue this work and to push us into new directions. I truly appreciate it, and I'm really honored and grateful that I had the opportunity to be part of this panel, moderating it, and you know, hoping that we will see more changes happening for the communities that we belong in, the communities that we advocate on behalf, and hopefully things next year, this time, we can look back and say, you know, it began here. We have moved the needle on some things. We have changed the way we have done certain things. And, you know, we continue to move forward. I don't know if Debbie has anything she wants to add. We have about 4 minutes, and I'll just turn it back over to her.
Thank you so much, Andre. I just wanted to say thank you for great moderation. Thank you to a fantastic, dynamic panel. You've surfaced and raised very many issues. You're all brilliant. I can imagine what the Feed Loop chat is looking like. And yes, Andre, I hope next year we are back together in person and that we're able to measure the movement forward that we've made as we develop new frameworks and a new normal moving forward post-COVID. Thank you all. Thank you to the audience and OCASI members. I will see you tomorrow morning.